On June 21st, 1942, Tobruk surrendered, and the Gazala campaign reached the moment that turned a battlefield defeat into an imperial shock. For weeks, Rommel had fought through the Gazala line, survived the danger of the cauldron, worn down British armor, forced the abandonment of the forward defense, and then struck Tobruk before it could become the fortress many hoped it still was. The port that had resisted for months in 1941 now fell after a rapid assault measured in hours and a surrender measured in consequences. This was not merely the end of one position in Libya. It was the collapse of a symbol, the loss of a major Allied stronghold, and the opening of the road east toward Egypt.
If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore.
The surrender came after the Axis assault had broken into Tobruk's defensive system and created a crisis that the garrison could no longer contain. Major General Hendrik Klopper, commanding a force that included South African, British, Indian, and other Allied troops, faced a situation in which the perimeter had been penetrated, communications and control were under severe strain, and organized resistance across the whole fortress was becoming increasingly difficult. Some local positions had fought hard, and many soldiers had not personally seen the entire battle collapse around them. That is one reason surrender inside a fortress can feel so disorienting. A man may still be holding his sector, while higher command knows the larger defense has already failed. The number of prisoners taken at Tobruk stunned the Allied world. Roughly 33,000 troops fell into Axis hands, one of the largest British and Commonwealth surrenders of the war up to that point. The figure mattered not only because it was large, but because it represented trained manpower that could not be quickly replaced in the desert campaign. These were not just names on a report. They were soldiers removed from the battle, families thrown into uncertainty, units broken, and a garrison that had been expected to delay Rommel instead carried off into captivity. The human scale of Tobruk's fall gave the disaster a weight that no map arrow could fully show.
The captured stores were almost as important as the prisoners. Tobruk held fuel, food, ammunition, vehicles, workshops, and equipment that Rommel's army desperately needed after weeks of hard movement and fighting. In the desert, captured supplies could turn a victory from a battlefield event into an operational opportunity. Rommel's forces had been repeatedly constrained by the long supply chain from Axis ports and by the endless burden of hauling everything forward across Libya. Tobruk's fall offered relief at the very moment when exhaustion and distance might otherwise have slowed him. The fortress had been valuable to the British because of what it contained. Once captured, those same stores helped strengthen the enemy.
This is why Tobruk's surrender cannot be separated from the logistics of the North African War. Ports, fuel dumps, truck parks, and depots were not background details behind the glamorous tank battle. They were the means by which armored operations continued or stopped. A tank army without fuel and ammunition becomes a collection of stranded machines, and a victory without supply may die before it can be exploited. Tobruk gave Rommel not only prestige, but practical resources for the advance toward Egypt. The capture did not solve every Axis logistical problem, but it gave the Panzer Army Africa a dramatic boost at a moment when momentum mattered. The political shock was immediate and severe. Prime Minister Winston Churchill received the news while in Washington, where Allied leaders were discussing the wider war, and Tobruk's fall landed as a blow to British confidence and prestige. The loss was painful because Tobruk had become one of the names through which the British public understood endurance in the desert. Its earlier siege had created a story of stubborn resistance, and now that story seemed to have been overturned almost overnight. To lose ground in the desert was bad enough, To lose Tobruk so quickly, with so many prisoners and so many supplies, made the defeat feel larger than the battlefield itself. Rommel's victory brought him immense prestige. Shortly after Tobruk fell, he was promoted to Field Marshal, becoming the youngest German officer to hold that rank at the time. The promotion reflected the scale of the victory, but it also fed the legend that Rommel could win in the desert by audacity alone. That legend must be handled carefully. Rommel's boldness mattered, and his command style shaped the campaign, but Gazala and Tobruk were not won by personality alone. They were won through movement, anti-tank defense, engineering, supply corridors, reconnaissance, artillery, infantry, air power, and the failure of British coordination at decisive moments.
For the British Eighth Army, Tobruk's fall deepened an already dangerous crisis. The army had retreated from Gazala, lost much of its armored strength, and now watched the fortress behind it collapse before it could slow Rommel in any meaningful way. Confidence in commanders, systems, and assumptions was shaken. The question was no longer whether the Gazala line could be restored, because that possibility had disappeared. The question was whether the British could stop Rommel before he entered Egypt and threatened the Nile Delta, Alexandria, and the Suez Canal. The campaign had moved from a battle for Libya into a struggle over the defense of Egypt itself.
The surrender also forced a reckoning with the idea of fortress defense in modern mobile war. Tobruk had guns, troops, stores, and reputation, but those things were not enough once the field army outside it had been defeated. A fortress can resist only when its defenses are prepared, its command system remains coherent, and the wider operational situation gives the garrison a purpose it can realistically fulfill. At Tobruk in 1942, the attacking force arrived with the initiative, struck with speed, and exploited a breach before the defense could settle into a long siege. The lesson was stark. A fortress left behind after a mobile defeat may become a trap faster than anyone expects.
There was also a moral and institutional shock inside the Allied forces. Many soldiers and officers had believed Tobruk could hold because it had held before, but the earlier siege had become a dangerous comparison. The conditions were not the same, the garrison was not the same, and the wider battle was not the same. A famous name can inspire confidence, but it can also hide uncomfortable changes in readiness, command, and operational context. Tobruk's fall showed that military memory can mislead when it turns a past success into a promise. Armies must study victories carefully because the enemy studies them too, and the next battle rarely repeats the last one on the same terms. For Rommel, Tobruk opened the road east, but it did not end the war in North Africa. His army had won a stunning victory, yet it still faced distance, supply strain, fatigue, mechanical wear, and an enemy that was retreating rather than destroyed. The advance into Egypt would carry the Axis toward a new defensive line, and eventually toward El Alamein, where the geography would narrow the battlefield in ways that favored a more stable Allied defense. Gazala and Tobruk gave Rommel his greatest desert triumph, but they also pulled him farther from his bases and deeper into the logistical problem that had haunted every army in the theater. Victory gave him momentum, but momentum still had to be fed. That is the bridge from this season to the next stage of the Desert War. Gazala showed how a defensive line could fail when fixed positions, minefields, armor, and command did not combine effectively. Bir Hakeim showed how local heroism could delay and inspire without saving the whole campaign. The Cauldron showed how an attacker apparently trapped could turn danger into advantage if the enemy failed to strike with unity. Tobruk showed how a fortress could fall quickly once the mobile shield around it had been broken. El Alamein would become the answer to these failures, not because it erased them, but because the British would have to learn from them under the pressure of survival.
The surrender of Tobruk was therefore both an ending and a warning. It ended the Gazala campaign with Rommel's greatest desert victory and one of Britain's most painful defeats of the war. It shocked London, strengthened Axis confidence, and sent the Eighth Army back toward Egypt under the shadow of a disaster few had expected to come so quickly. Yet it also clarified the brutal truth at the center of modern armored warfare. Tanks win nothing alone. Fortresses stand only within a larger system, and courage cannot compensate forever for broken coordination, lost initiative, and failed operational control. Gazala led directly to El Alamein because after Tobruk fell, there was no longer any room for illusion. The Desert War had reached the edge of Egypt, and the next battle would have to stop Rommel there.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.